Okay, welcome everybody to this side event that will explore options to reduce sulfur hexafluoride emissions in electricity generation. My name is Juliana Kessler. I'm a researcher and consultant at Perspectives Climate Research and leading the work on carbon markets at Perspectives. Let me introduce you to today's agenda and our speakers. First, we will hear from Thomas Ford. Thomas Ford is an advisor and senior expert at the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action. And the ministry supports the reduction of SF6 emissions by supporting the preparation of a possible international initiative to mitigate sulfur hexafluoride emissions in the power sector in the framework of the German government's international climate initiative. Then we will hear, and actually, unfortunately, online participation is not possible. So we had foreseen an intervention by Carsten Burgess, but Axel will kindly jump in to cover his presentation, as unfortunately this is not possible due to technical reasons. So we will then hear a presentation by Axel Mikhailova on the technical economic evaluation of SF6 abatement. And Axel is a research director and senior carbon market expert at Perspectives Climate Research and an economist and expert in international climate policy. With over 20 years of experience, Axel is eager to apply his knowledge to foster innovative SF6 mitigation options for carbon market mechanisms. And last but not least, I'm delighted that Vicky Jansen is joining us today. So Vicky Jansen is General Manager Southeast Asia at the Swiss Foundation for Climate Protection and Carbon Offset, in short, CLIC. And as CLIC's representative for Southeast Asia, Vicky is exploring innovative and effective ways to reduce GHG emissions through carbon finance, such as opportunities to tackling SF6 emissions in the region. So what is so interesting about SF6 is that it is the strongest known GHG gas, but its emissions have so far received very little attention in international climate protection. SF6 is mainly originated from gas-induced insulated switchgear in the electricity infrastructure, and the SF6 emissions threatened to rise sharply during grid expansion, especially in developing and emerging economies. Thomas, may I ask you to introduce the topic further and to enlighten us on the German government actions when it comes to tackling non-CO2 emissions such as SF6?
So, thank you so much for coming here at a short notice. It is not so optimal prepared in the program. So maybe this is the reason, but I appreciate that you are here. Our idea is here really to think about the electricity sector. Many things from this slide have been already told by Juliana. So what we think is that we can address the strongest emission certainly through two ways, and this is to reflect in our initiative. Of course, you can have a national regulation. The EU has done it with the so-called F-gas ordinance, and there's SF6 a part of it. So if you, as a country, can do this, then it's okay. I think that's the easiest way, because we expect that the economic feasibility to integrate it in the expansion and the recovery of electricity grids is dependent on the economy of the country, whether it's long enough or not. But our discussion here with the international initiative goes beyond the developed countries. We would like to see chances that with the big expansion in many developing countries, it is not that clear that it could be integrated. So there is maybe a barrier of awareness also of the economic numbers, but also the understanding of the company when they are saying we are expanding the grid, that we are doing it like we have done it years, decades before. That's the point. And in our initiative, we are not reflecting only on carbon markets, but of course we hope for some cases where we can do it. What we want from the German side is a sectoral initiative. That's the point that we would like to upscale and not having only small and medium-sized mitigation activities. But we would like to see a big chance realized with the NDCs of our country, especially in the case when the potential might get in the next 10 years to a really low-hanging fruit, which has no financial additionality. This should be integrated then in the NDCs of the host countries as a self-regulation. But it's a lot of time until this is the case. Maybe it's a decade, maybe less, maybe it depends from country to country and from technical application and technical application, because not all technologies are really available. And what we hear later is that we also see that the costs of these technologies are really varying, and we cannot calculate it on the lowest number every year. So it depends a lot from the implementation in the next years. Therefore, we think we have to accelerate this initiative, this climate finance, this carbon market. And this could not be only done for the new installation. It's clear that you can have a strategy on it where maybe regional development banks supporting with their portfolio, developing countries could integrate it. This is certainly one task we would like to address. But we would like also to see that in other cases it could be helpful to use climate finance money for a demonstration project to convince people. And therefore, we are working together not only with the market division in our ministry, but also with the technology mechanism people. So already last year, we have talked with Kenya to realize the demonstration project. And also this is not that easy, but we would like to have both flows to make it complete worldwide to set examples. And I think this is the status of today from the strategy building. And what we see is, what I've said here in this slide, it's clear, it will become a low-hanging fruit. And we have done it with the fertilizer industry, where we have end-to-end emission reduction to a cheap price between $1 and $3 or $4 per ton. This is something which belongs to the host country, to the NDCs, and in this case is supported also with climate finance, some installations, and some countries have really committed themselves in the NDC to take it over. So the case is simple because this is a bigger installation, and we have maybe this renewing of the catalyst a period of 10 years before the host country must take over or must integrate it in the policy of the companies. But in SF6, these are small installations, a completely different case. Therefore, we have a preparation project for this initiative, where we would like to undergo certain research. We have two stories where we are exploring the countries. This is one side of the analyzing. The other side is the question of the economy of these micro installations and whether it's activity or not. This is not so clear for us. But it's clear you will find something. But at the end, you must know which countries with which policies are ready to do so. And what is also necessary when we have the basic work, actually will tell about those cases. Is that we need networking. We have started this year with the development thing, and it's very difficult. The understanding is there, but how to integrate it in the expansion policy on the basis of the global structural outcome is the critical goal of renewables. There is a clear need for them to integrate these things too. And of course, they would also like to know what are the real costs in addition to what they have done so far. So that means that you would like to find the partners in the companies, in the banks, in the financial sector, in the politics of the hot country, because there is, of course, no need. These activities cannot be paid by climate finance or markets alone. It's an add-on and it should bring it over the threshold. This is the whole strategy behind it. And of course, there are different organizations with own interest in the sector. We are not alone. I think that it's absolutely clear that many organizations are aware of this, and we hope that we can push it forward with others together and find ways to incentivize the market. When companies would like to have carbon neutrality, we would like to tell this story very good, that these are convincing use cases for the claims of the companies on one side, and in country cooperation, I think we need also to mobilize climate finance because it is not this big project running under the carbon market, but both together can convince us. So as here with this rough explanation of the strategy, I hope it will become more clear when we have the analytical work done. And it's right. I hand over to you, Axel, or first to you. Okay.
Thank you, Thomas, very much for outlining the German government's plan regarding SF6 statement. Next, I may ask Axel to come forward and to enlighten us on the technical economic evaluation. And I think you could also directly go into a potential role that carbon markets could play. Let me bring up the presentation.
Okay, I think I'll stay sitting here because otherwise I just block and not be visible. So, Julie, if you would pass me the device. Yes. So, as said, we have been working with my colleague Carsten Burgess, who is an electrical engineer and expert in the field. So we have, of course, looked at the policy landscape. So we see in a number of countries regulation emerge, particularly in the EU, which has a mandate for certain voltage levels to have only SF6-free usage here from the second half of this decade. And with various North American states, not the federal level, but the state level that have similar approaches. We also know that D77 has put 2035 as an end date for new installations. And of course, we also see the tendency both in the grid operators to look at this more closely, and we see progress in the technology. So for low and medium voltages, the SF6-free technology is already available. We see a lot of manufacturers of equipment to state, that they will be very quickly able to also have such equipment for the high voltage. The big challenge is that the actual costs of this equipment are not yet clearly known. Of course, we have certain announcements, but the implementation on the ground, of course, we still need to learn what the actual costs are. Here we have scenario. So on the left-hand side, you see the overall stock of SF6 in the world. And you see this is would be rising massively. And this rise, of course, in the short to medium term is difficult to contain. But the critical aspect is what happens in the second half of the century. So there, the difference between policy scenarios and non-policy scenarios becomes huge. And this is even clearer when then you look at the emissions, which is in the second panel, which in the context of business as usual would really rise yeah, in a meteoric fashion, multiplying by 5 to 10 times. Whereas in the phase-out scenario, we would be able to reduce them to 0. And this is billions of tons of CO2 equivalent, this difference. So it's really significant on a global level, whether we have a cumulative emission of, let's say, 5 to 7 billion tons over this century, or 50 billion tons. And as you know, 50 billion tons is the annual emission of the world nowadays. So one needs to address this technology. Then, of course, if you look at specific regions, you see that Asia is really the spotlight. Because in Asia, we have the largest expansion of electricity grids, and we have also, of course, the strongest expansion of this gas-insulated technology, which is appropriate for dense settlements. Because, well, if you have a lot of space, you don't need the stuff which is more expensive than the air-insulated, but the gas-insulated is appropriate for large cities, and of course in Asia we have a particular density of such settlements. So one sees that, addressing this in Asia is actually the critical aspect that we need to do. And you also see, of course, that there the policy measures actually can reach to relatively rapid improvements. What is fascinating in this field is that the estimates regarding the mitigation costs of the various approaches that you can have are different, have significant differences. So, for example, the simplest mitigation option that you just have a good, careful handling of the gas in all processes, for example, putting it into the switchgear at the manufacturing stage, then dealing with the refills of gas as it leaks from the device. There, of course, you have fairly low cost and simple mitigation options. So some of that may even be profitable, so we have negative costs. Whereas if we now have the recovery of SF6 at the end of life of switchgear, this already becomes significantly more expensive. And of course, if you then want to now control the leaks during the operational period, then the costs become really high. And you see that, of course, the policy instruments that are appropriate depend strongly on where the costs are really situated. So it's clear that negative cost options could definitely be integrated in the NDC from the outset. Low cost options should be integrated in the unconditional part of the NDC, whereas the medium cost measures may be appropriate for carbon markets, and the very high cost measures may be appropriate for public climate finance. So we need to have a much better understanding of this in the future, and the initiative, of course, was trying to develop this understanding. Here we have a specific example. So if you now look at this cost curve, and I will spend a bit of time to explain it, because at first glance it's not easy to understand. So here at the lower level, well, I don't have a pointer, so this is that the cost of new equipment which is not containing SF6 would be at the same level as the cost of traditional equipment. And here we have the increase. So if the cost would be 80% higher, we would be at that point. And here, these different families of lines, they are linked to the leakage rate of the equipment. So if we have very good maintenance of equipment, the leakage rate can be in the order of magnitude of, let's say, 30% per year. Whereas badly maintained equipment can have a leakage of 5% per year. So you see it's a massive difference. And of course, the more leaks, the higher the abatement that you would have from replacing the equipment. And therefore, of course, the abatement costs would be much lower for the high leakage compared to the low leakage rates. And that's why we have these massive differences in costs. So here we have a logarithmic scale. So that's costs of 10 of 100,000. And of course, you then see here we have the different voltage ranges. So the blue curves are for the medium voltage range, and the red ones are for the high voltage, the transmission, long distance transmission lines. So just to show how much we need to learn and to see what is the value of the promises of the equipment producers. Are they really able to bring down the costs almost to the same level of the current equipment, and in which maintenance context is the equipment actually being used? So we need a much better mapping of this in the future. So to conclude regarding the technical aspects, we have a massive business as usual increase of the SF6 emissions and also equipment that is focused in Asia. We already see that in the big Asian emerging economies, the intensity is quite high compared to other countries. It is very clear that just looking at an improved maintenance of SF6 containing equipment, the question cannot be resolved, even if the leakages are low, given the high expected increase of the use of such equipment as the grid is being expanded. And with regard to the costs, we need to understand where do the costs actually lie and which policy instruments are most appropriate for different aspects of the mitigation cost. So if you have questions on the technical part, we could bring them up now. So please come in.
Thank you very much for your brilliant slide and sharing. So my question is, what is needed for developing a SF6 mitigation projects for carbon markets, for example, MRV or methodologies or upfront finance, etc. Thank you.
Yes, actually, I will address the carbon markets in the second part of the presentation. Now we could focus on actually the technical aspects. So baseline estimation globally and of course the technical maturity.
I think we have a question over there. No, yes, go for it.
Yeah, any work that you're aware of the establishment of baseline and more strong information on the leakage rates? I think some of the references are to US EPA data points, which probably have the most structured data, but it doesn't necessarily represent what's happening in Southeast Asia, Africa, or Middle East. So what's your hope and what are the initiatives for baselining?
Well, there is of course some information on, for example, China and the Asian countries. Indeed, for Africa, there is nothing. So there is definitely a significant need to have closer on the ground assessment of the actual leakage rates. So a lot of the stuff, even in this US EPA study, is rather theoretical, and we need much more grounding in actual measurements on the ground. Any
further questions? Otherwise, we will move on to the next part where we look at the role of carbon markets. Okay, let's move on then.
Good. So we are, of course, not only talking about carbon markets, we are talking about all the climate policy instruments. So this year is highly stylized approach at where the different policy instruments fit best. So if we assume we have a marginal abatement cost curve that first is negative, so we have profitable measures still due to certain inefficiencies in the economy, and then the cost will rise as the mitigation volume increases. So classically, we would see the situation that a country has an unconditional part of the NDC, and the government implicitly or explicitly decides to have a threshold up to which unconditional measures are to be mobilized. So we have here, sorry, this has moved a bit. At this level, there is what I would call the NDC cost threshold. So it means the government through domestic budget would fund this. So it would be under a domestic policy instrument. Then we would have measures that whose costs are above this threshold, but below the price of ICMOs on the international market. So we would then see the carbon markets mobilizing them because there can be profit from the difference between the mitigation cost and the ICMO price. And then we would have those measures that have costs that are higher than the ICMO price. And for this, we would maybe need a combination of different sort of elements of finance or even pure public international climate finance. So very stylized, and of course the curves can have different shapes and they can move over time, but here just as a principal approach to how to allocate the policy instruments. And now, of course, there may be a number of different policy instruments that you can use. For example, you could have the direct regulation, which, as mentioned earlier, is already applied in a number of countries, or well, applied for some future dates. So the prohibition of SF6 use, or you could also have a recycling mandate, or one could have a destruction mandate for equipment at the end of the lifetime. Then there would be all kinds of fiscal instruments. So you can have subsidy, you can have a greenhouse gas or carbon tax, you can have all kinds of supportive financing mechanisms like soft loans or guarantees, or you could also have a public carbon fund where activity developers can submit proposals. And of course, there can then be policy instruments that straddle both. For example, the government could make the acquisition of recycled SF6, so that would be both a regulatory and a fiscal instrument. Of course, we also would have the classical market mechanisms, ETS. For example, in the Korean ETS, SF6 is already covered, or one could trade specific SF6 usage certificates that would, whose volume could be reduced over time as we want to phase out the gas. And of course, you can again combine those that, for example, the SF6 emission credits could serve against fiscal instruments like a carbon tax or ETS. Now, with regard to the public climate finance, of course, we are negotiating this year. So everybody is talking about grant and concession loans as public climate finance. We have already a lot of experience with public finance under the Montreal Protocol, where there's the multilateral fund, which is funded by the developed countries and which then allocates funding for mitigation in developing countries. So it has been operational for many years now, and there is a kind of routine of using. Then, of course, given that the switchgear production is currently mostly concentrated in developed countries, the export credit agencies would be brought politically on board to focus on funding of SF6, replacing switchgear exports to developing countries. And of course, if one would grant such export credits, these type of technologies would become more effective. There can be types of blended finance And of course, we would also be able to mobilize technical assistance to cover, for example, those steps with regard to understanding where the emissions come from, how to handle the transition. The electricity grid operators need to understand what is the difference in performance and how to implement the new equipment and so on. And of course, we have now a number of countries with energy transition partnerships, which want to expand their renewable electricity production, which often face a challenge with regard to grid expansion. So if one can now mobilize funding for low SF6 grid expansion, it would, of course, overall help to have a low carbon transition in its entirety. And I've been working quite a lot on energy transitions in Southeast Asia, and so far there has not really been a discussion of this aspect. So it would be really timely to bring it in right now. With regard to international carbon markets, of course, you know, they are the negotiations. There are the two main avenues, Article 6.2, the bilateral approach, or the international mechanism under Article 6.4. So, of course, Article 6.4, we've seen at this top the agreement on the standards for methodologies. So we know that these standards will be more stringent, and that, of course, partially answers your question, that we would now, in the next year, get the opportunity to submit methodologies under 6.4, and of course, one could try within such an initiative to actually develop, submit such a methodology. Then, of course, we could have an innovative approach if we go beyond project-based crediting. We've seen in the past under the development mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol, actually some SF6 projects already participated. How to work on project-based crediting, but as we discussed, there are various policy instruments, and we need to see whether we could harness policy instruments for generating credits under Article 6. Policy crediting has been a contentious discussion item over the past years, and we are now seeing some initiatives emerging. For example, the gold standard is making an approach, and I'm sure the gold standard also wants to expand it to Article 6. And we see the GIZ Institute also trying to bring this on board. So the question would be which types of policies actually would be advanced for the future. A critical precondition is that, of course, SF6 would have to be covered by the national emission inventories and the NDCs, because otherwise it would not be attractive for host countries to actually engage in carbon market projects due to the need for corresponding adjustment. So to conclude, we in the initiative would have to work first to ensure that SF6 gets actually into the NDCs under the revision that is due in 2025 and is being monitored properly. Then, of course, we need to better understand where the actual mitigation costs lie, to understand which policy instruments are relevant for which technology. We would think that public climate finance could serve as a Kickstarter, whereas carbon market revenues could then take on for those activities with the mitigation cost range that is below the ICMO price. And of course, we would hope that domestic emission trading systems provide an incentive to also buy significant. So what we see is that for policy crediting, there needs to be much more work, also how to address the additionality of the action. And overall, in the context of the initiative, we would have to see how the business model for grid expansion can actually be supported through transmission fees, and that these transmission fees that are levied for the producers of renewable electricity, that those take into account the implementation of the no or zero SF6 equipment in the context of the greater dimension. So thanks with that, and I'm happy now, of course, to answer questions and get into the comments.
Thank you, Axel. Before we move to the Q&A session, I would like to invite Vicky Jensen back to the stage. And for those that have recently joined, Vicky is the General Manager for Southeast Asia at the Swiss Foundation for Climate Protection and Carbon Offset, LIC in brief. And Vicky, you have been carefully listening, and you also heard that there is quite a huge potential for SF6 abatement in Asia. So what are your thoughts on this? Can you share something, and what are you planning at LIC as well regarding this?
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. I was looking at my note. I don't know what I still need to say because I think a lot of things have been covered. But so for those who, just a few of you who might not know CLIC, we are a compliance buyer under the Swiss CO2 law. And in the specific context of Article 6, we are one of the main implementer partners of the Swiss government in countries where they have a bilateral agreement. So this is the context where we come in. And yeah, SF6 has been a big interest for us. The first good news is that it's eligible according to the Swiss CO2 law. So, and it's a good news because there is such a great potential of emissions reductions, because unfortunately it's, as we've seen before, it's a lot of emissions that are happening right now. The fact that it's also such a big potential is very relevant for us because we're only looking at quite large programs that usually get between minimum 250,000 ITMOs or ton per CO2 emissions reductions by program until 2030. In bigger countries, it's even 500,000 minimums. So in that context, again, it's a big of interest for us. And also the fact that there are not that many initiatives, not so much attention, not enough, that have been put into SF6. So it's also another opportunity for us. And this is why we actually really welcome this SF6 initiatives. It's a great timing. We hope that there can be synergies also on seeing how we can work together on that. Now, in which countries is that possible, or would it would be of interest for us? So I have a few flyers here. The Swiss government has at the moment 13 bilateral agreements. They're on the back of these flyers. They are in African countries, Latin America, Caribbean, very few in Asia. We're hoping for a few more. There are this week actually some discussions and then meetings between the Swiss government and potential partner countries. And then from these countries, we have to look at what Axel you already mentioned before. First thing, very simple, is to look at if the SF6 is mentioned as the NDC. And then the second thing is how, or if it's reported and if it's in the greenhouse gas inventory. And this is very important because without this, we don't have a baseline. And then without a baseline, we cannot do corresponding adjustment. And that's not possible to have a transaction under Article 6.2 without CA. Now, if we look a bit more about those different countries where we are working with already. So first step, we checked about the NDC, and there we would have Tunisia, Chile, Uruguay, Peru, Ukraine, Thailand. Then second step, if we look at the reporting, then we have Chile, Ukraine, Thailand. The first good news when we looked at the 2018 reporting was, yes, this is reported. Then if you look at the reporting a bit later, 2020 or 2022, now I don't remember, we were looking at this with potential partners. Yeah. They say lack of data, no reporting. So it's problematic again because we don't have this baseline, no corresponding adjustment. That's the ideal context to start looking if we can work with these countries. Of course, reporting in the inventory, that's something that can be added. You also mentioned that it could be added in the NDC. So we can have this dialogue with the government. If they're interested in adding those gases and other gases, HFCs, etc., other F gases, for example, in the inventory, it could give them an opportunities of working potentially on Article 6. So it's not the easiest way, but that's a dialogue that we can have with the partner countries. And then, of course, if those countries are already part of the SF6 initiatives, for example, that dialogue could be facilitated. So yeah, of great interest, quite initial analysis at the moment, and then very happy if there's any of you, that is willing to engage with us and try to propose programs and develop projects together.
Yeah, thank you very much, Vicky. And with this, I would like to open for questions from the audience. And Thomas, perhaps you also want to come back to the stage. Any questions in the room? And perhaps great if you could also quickly state your name and your organizational affiliation. Yes, you have a question over there. May I ask Mr. Quinn to use the mic? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Alexi with Eco Securities. It's a bit of a new subject for me, so a couple of questions. First of all, maybe question for Vicky or Axel. What other market mechanisms of the green ETS, for instance, or what other crediting mechanisms include XF6? Are there any local crediting mechanisms that have methodologies for XF6, like Sulphur, for instance, in Thailand, and so on? Yeah.
So, as said, a Korean ETS includes SS6 formally. The South African crediting against the carbon tax includes everything CDM. So, of course, under CDM, we have one methodology for electric switchgear. So, of course, CDM is now over, so we can't have new projects. But of course, one could directly take that methodology and the South African regulators could take it up again. Yeah, so these are the two cases I'm aware of. Otherwise, the domestic crediting programs don't yet have it in, but of course, it would be the target of the initiative to actually ensure that this is duly covered as far as possible.
Over there, yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Lucius from Planet 2015. Maybe a question about engaging in the dialogue with grids. I mean, we talk about nations, but the one who have the data about switchgear emissions or the grid operators mainly. We have a case of high voltage switchgear that are controlled by industrial partners directly, industrial companies, but mostly is the grid. And what we see, I mean, we've been in discussion with a few, is there's a little bit of reluctance. Basically grid saying there's no issue with SF6 in our country. We are managing it correctly. There is no leakage. So obviously it's a little bit of a taboo topic that I think we need to open up, especially as people realize, well, SF6 has to go in the NDCs. We need to act about this. I think there will be a little bit of dual forces between government and grid operators, like technical teams. Maybe one is just a lack of capability and knowledge about the data that is simply not reported, but the other one is specifically about reluctance to disclose this data. So what are best practices or examples that we can have to?
Well, I just give an historical example. So about 25 years ago, there was a very limited awareness on emissions of industrial gases from chemical production. There were a few theoretical studies by consultancy and think tanks, but very few. Then CDM came. Within 3 years, all relevant plants in the world who had emissions of these industrial gases were aware of them and were queuing to get credits from the CDM. Of course, this doesn't translate now 100% in the situation of SF6, because at that time it was very clear that the mitigation costs are rather low. Therefore, the revenue from the sale of credits and the gross profit can be very high. But still, I would expect that grid operators, which are usually really strapped for cash, would think about opportunities to generate revenues from grid operation, and therefore, would be willing to provide data as long as there is no, let's say, direct competitive impact, but I don't see many countries that have real competition for grid operation. So I would hope that the historical example would actually apply also to the SF6.
Yeah, I think this is just a question. The reason why the government should come in. We are not doing the investment. We are not doing the research. But we can do the bilateral framework. We have not so much experience in the moment. Our first step is to reach out to the development banks. Hope that they are the intermediary when it comes to the expansion of the grid. There, with the analysis of the most relevant countries, we are going for bilateral talk rounds and put it on the agenda. We have experiences with some relevant countries, China, for example, for the NPO sector. At the end, it's clear we are not financing from the German side any CDM project at this time, or now also not any 6-4 plan. But the technical cooperation that the Chinese environmental ministry and the line ministries could think about. And then there is some room for technical advice, bringing people together. I think this is possible to support it. But at the moment, where the country needs financial support. Let me be frank, this has been forgotten. After Paris, we have a good situation. We got 80 million euros for our NPO initiative. How much of it now? I would challenge myself in the same dimension. But we hope that it's not necessary, because there should be an incentive to do the Article 6.4 project. This means we are supported for the methodology update to Article 6.4, that it's one of our issues to make it clear that it should be done. I have nothing against the top saying in their state, but maybe not, because they are not, maybe also not convinced that it's the right use of their resources. So we find out that in the next time to analyze from the countries and the variation of supply. So then you take it for sure. Then you go Article 6 only at the moment with the management of the SF6 anything. Okay, this is an important part, but this goes not deep enough into the investments, right? So there's a lot of things to do and to collaborate. So we hopefully take some partners on board. And from the company side, when we have developed such investments, we have two. The one we would like to stay carbon neutral. We are clearly saying this is possible. This is not possible where you don't know where they will. So that's for sure that we are putting the work that done. And the second thing, the companies, the technical companies which are producing these units should be on board, because they have the advantage. And it's, of course, sometimes you get critics of the world company. Worldwide, they are more. There are a lot of more things, and therefore we see the chart that we have such a preparation project, bring something into move. Let's see. We have to accomplish this. We have to turn to Germany to get our election, and then we'll forget it. Oh.
Can I just follow with one topic? We've seen in some contexts, actually the best leverage is to start with having data on existing SF6 bank and leakages. There's in Germany one leader company for IoT sensors for SF6, which is called Vika. And so the transistor inside the switchgear. Could this type of project be actually a candidate for climate finance, either in a policy-based or carbon-based finance? Because if we don't have that monitoring, there's nowhere we start, and we cannot establish baseline. We cannot know where the issues are. So could we finance this type of project, the implementation of sensor, as a first step, maybe of something else?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. We must get the financing after preparation for this. That is more than a little bit more than 1 million. We could even is the climate change. We have already this year to go a little bit more forward. The answer was our whole price, and so not really good for the activity. But I see this coming back again, of course. But on the question of the finance, it's not so direct investment of 6 months a day, but also around. We have to look into the conditions to move forward. And what we have said would be, in my view, part of the question was how we make clear for which activities we need finance. This is not directly only in the mitigation sector, also on the preparations and partners would be converted. That would be it.
Thank you very much. Do we have a further question from the audience? Final question. Please go ahead. No? Okay, good. Okay, thank you so much. Then I would like to close this event. Please join me in a round of applause for our speakers, and thanks for sticking around.